Welcome to Missions Life, where we share resources and encouragement for current missionaries, future missionaries, and those praying for missionaries. Missions can be hard, and we want to help you face the challenges of life, leadership, and ministry. We want your life to bear fruit for the gospel wherever you are. I'm Kyle Farran, here with my co-host and wife, Heather.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Missions Life podcast. Today, we have a very special guest on our podcast. I'm probably going to say my favorite guest of all the guests we have had and will ever had. Today, I want to welcome Kyle Farran. Welcome to your own podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I know. What an introduction, huh?
Yes.
I sure hope you can live up to it here with this interview.
I hope so.
Well, the reason that I wanted to interview Kyle today is just because of how much I love the book that he wrote and how much I love the heart behind it and the story behind it. So for those of you who don't know, Kyle wrote a book called Overflowing: Ministry and Missions that Flow from the Heart. You started journaling on this topic back in 2011, huh?
Yeah.
If anyone knows Kyle, most of his early mornings are spent journaling and reading scripture. And you kind of started noticing a theme coming out about this idea that our heart is way more important than just the daily tasks and work that we do for God. So I'm really excited to ask a few questions and to dig into what this book was all about. So, the first big question: why did you write the book Overflowing? I touched on it a little bit, but take us deeper.
Yeah. The big reason I wrote is, like you said, it was an outflowing of my personal journey and learning to minister not out of busyness, but from an overflow of the heart. When we first started off in missions, I was just go, constantly busy. And now being busy and committed in ministry is good. We shouldn't be lazy, but there's that tendency to become addicted to busyness. And when that happens, we can start evaluating our ministry by how busy we are rather than how our walk with the Lord is. And we start evaluating ourselves by what we are doing, not what God is doing in us and around us. And so the two key things that really triggered the book was first studying in 2 Timothy 2:20 and 21, which says, "Now in a great house there are not only vessels of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay, some for honorable use, some for dishonorable. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from what is dishonorable, he'll be a vessel for honorable use, set apart as holy, useful to the master of the house, ready for every good work." And as I studied through that, I realized that if I truly desired a ministry that God blessed, that his power flowed through, that my focus was all wrong. I'd been focused on my doing, and God wanted me to focus on my being. So that was really the first key trigger. Another one was just an experience I had where I was working on our 4x4. I was underneath the car, laying on my back, trying to change the oil on that. And I could not get this stupid oil filter off. And I remember being frustrated and angry. Which is always a really brilliant idea to inanimate object. But as I thought about that, I realized that I was frustrated, not so much that with the oil filter, but I was frustrated that it was taking time that was keeping me from doing ministry. And God really challenged me at that time, Kyle, who you are is more important than what you do. And from then on, that really just flipped everything on its head. My focus has been on my heart first and foremost. And the actions, they flow out of my heart. And God really wanted me to be serving from the right heart. And it's really just changed to put character as the top priority just in everything.
Yeah, absolutely. How many times do we go through our day and think, check, 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 I got a bunch done. I did a bunch for God, but I could have done it in an angry spirit or, in a prideful way and not really stop at all and consider the condition of my heart.
Mm-hmm.
The title of the book is Overflowing. In the book, you use an illustration of an overflowing stream. Could you kind of unpack that illustration for us? I think it'll help everybody.
Yeah. So when we were missionaries, when we were in South Africa, we lived at an hour from the game park. which is one of the oldest game parks there. And living so close, we had kind of like a week or a pass to
Like
the
a zoo
park, kind
pass.
of like a zoo pass, yeah. And our kids would actually get kind of tired of it because we would go a lot because we'd take all of our guests there. And I loved it. But we'd always try to get there when the gate opened, which is also probably another reason the kids didn't like it as much because that was about 5 or 6 a.m. And we'd try to get out to the river, drive out to the river by sunrise because that's where all the animals were. They would all come to the river early in the morning to get a drink. And we could just sit there and sip our coffee and watch the elephants, lions, giraffe, or a ton of other animals come and drink. And I remember one year there was a drought and all the watering holes dried up and the river was just actually just a trickle. And when that happened, all the animals were by the river. They couldn't visit any watering holes anymore. And it was just such a strong example of how water is needed for life. And without it, the animals die. And there was another amazing game park in Africa that we never made it to, but the Okavango Delta is up in Botswana. And that's really the picture I had in mind as I was writing this illustration, because it's the only place in the world like it where a river literally runs into the middle of the desert and stops. And every year it floods and turns that desert into an amazing, lush game park where animals come from hundreds of miles to find refreshment. And the way this relates to us is that the reason a river is useful is because it takes water to far off places, and that's its purpose. But a dry river or a dry stream bed, it's not useful at all. And but when that river in the Okavango Delta, when it is filled and overflowing, it spills over and it provides life to all those animals. And God's purpose for us is to be like an overflowing stream, and that's what makes us useful. And He wants us to be overflowing to other people around us. And so the illustration kind of had four parts to it. The first part is the spring, and a spring is that like an underground source of water that just spills out day by day, coming from this underground spring, and it pours out unpolluted water. And for us, life is all about that spring. We stay connected to God because God is our eternal spring. He's the fountain of living waters, and He is the source of everything good that comes from us. And so we exist to magnify Him. So that's the first part, is the spring. The second part is the stream. And a stream would be just like a bed of dry rocks unless it stays connected to the spring. And we're like that spring bed, or that stream bed, sorry. By ourselves, we're empty. We don't have anything to offer. And Jesus said, apart from me, you can do nothing. But when our life is connected to the spring, God flows through us. And this is where our strength to minister to other people comes from. It's only when we stay connected and depending on His power that our ministry will result in anything truly spiritual happening. We have to stay connected to the spring. And the third part is the barriers. And when you think about a stream, and if you took a bunch of rocks and trash and you dumped it into the mouth of the stream, what happens? Well, the water gets all dammed up, it stops flowing. And in our lives, when we allow sin to get into our life, it's kind of like throwing rocks and trash into the mouth of the stream. It hinders the water from flowing. And spiritually, when we allow sin in our life, it hinders God's power flowing through us. And so if we're allowing sins to remain in our life, that's really hindering that God's power flowing through us and working in our lives. And I love thinking about how water is actually always searching. Even if it's just sitting still, it's always searching. And what it's searching for is no resistance, no barriers. And God says in 2 Chronicles 16:9, the eyes of the Lord roam to and fro throughout the earth so that He may strongly support those whose heart is completely His. And the fourth part of the illustration is the oasis. In the Okavango Delta in Botswana, it's like that oasis that provides water for countless animals in the middle of a desert, middle of barrenness. And this is what our life is like when we are filled to overflowing. So that's really the essence of the nutshell version of those the illustration there.
No, that's great. I love it. I mean, we can all picture, I think, in our heads, a beautifully well flowing river opposed to something that's maybe clogged somewhere or something that's just down to a trickle. You know, kind of like the time you took Natalie hiking out in the middle of the summer when it was super hot and promised her a waterfall, and you guys walked forever, and the waterfall was pretty much
It was dried up and
right.
just a stagnant
Yeah,
pond.
but that's disappointing. I mean, if we apply that illustration to our life, like I don't want to be a dried up stream or a disappointing waterbed when people need refreshment. Um, so, what is the main idea that you hope readers walk away from with this book?
I think the bottom line is to focus on our heart. Uh, the phrase that really resonated with me is, "Who you are is more important than what you do, because what you do flows out of who you are." So if I could encourage people to remember one thing, that would probably be it.
So, let's dive into that a little bit. Why is it so important for Christ followers to pay attention to our heart, to minister from a heart that's filled up with God?
I think the biggest reason is to glorify God. I
Mm.
mean, God's ultimate goal in everything He does is His glory. So, and He's worthy of that. Yeah, we exist to glorify God. Isaiah 48:11 says, for my own sake, I do it. How should my name be profaned? My glory I will not give to another." So we see really clearly just how God He's working for His glory. So that's His goal. And if our goal is to be able to serve God and to come alongside and work with Him, then His goal needs to become our goal. And when we minister from the heart, it helps to glorify God because it shows a few things about God. It shows that He's worthy of our obedience. It shows that He's worthy of glory. But if we don't minister from the heart, or if we try to minister from our own strength, it makes God look really weak. It diminishes the way His glory is seen. It hinders His glory from being seen as clearly. And in the book, I use an illustration of a king who sends his servants to a different land. And if that servant was disobedient to the king, or tries to take glory that belongs to the king, or doesn't trust the king, it makes the king look weak and not glorious to the people in the land. And the reason this is important to us is if we want God's support in ministry, who do you think God's going to give strong support, His support to? Like it's said in Second Chronicles 16:9, the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to give strong support to those whose heart is blameless toward Him. And so that idea that God is searching, wow, I mean, God is looking for servants to pour out His strength on. So if we're wanting to see God pour out His strength in our life and our ministry, then our number one focus needs to be becoming the kind of person He says He's going to do that to. Says He's going to pour out His strength on. And if we're ministering from our heart, then it's going to be God's strength flowing through us instead of us trying to do it in our own strength. Like John 15:5, apart from me, you can do nothing. And we really can't do anything of any spiritual value unless God really pours out His strength on us. And practically, if we don't focus on our heart, we're gonna have problems. We're gonna have major problems as we try to work out in our own strength these how to serve God. And our sin's going to hinder God's flow of power in our life because sin is going to be filling the space that God really wants to fill. So we need to be becoming the kind of person that God says He's going to support.
Absolutely, yeah. In the book and earlier, you mentioned some barriers to ministering from the heart. Can you talk about those a little bit?
Yeah, there's three key barriers that's mentioned in the book, and these really come from as you go through Scripture. It seems to be that there's these key themes that keep coming up over and over again, and some of the things that God says He's looking for. And so The barriers are kind of the opposite of those of what he's looking for. So God says that he's looking for holiness. So the opposite of that is disobedience. And I'll unpack these a little bit. So he also says he's looking for faith, and the opposite of that is unbelief. He says that he's looking for humility, and the opposite of that is pride. So the three barriers there are disobedience, pride, and unbelief. And the first, disobedience, obedience is obviously submitting to God's commands. If we're calling other people, as God's servants, we're calling other people to submit to the Lord, but if we are allowing sin to remain in our lives, then we're trying to serve with a divided heart. A little illustration that's been helpful to me is if you were to picture yourself kind of standing somewhere and you had a circle drawn around you, and those inside that circle are all of God's commands and gifts, and everything are inside that circle there. And you look outside the circle and you're like, oh, actually, I want that outside the circle. And you step outside the circle. And every time we do that, what we're doing is we're looking at God's commands and we're saying, you know what? That's not important to us. Like I'm not going to follow that. And I'm going to choose to step outside of God's commands and God's laws to go for something else and serve sin and Satan. And that makes God look very small, and it cuts us off from his power flowing through us. I also share in the book how sin and Satan really want to destroy us. They want to make us ineffective in ministry because it really does cut us off from God's strength flowing through us as we step into sin. And so in the book, I share an illustration, or a story actually, from back in South Africa when we were in the game park. There was a time when we were, thankfully, it was just myself, my father-in-law, and a friend of his that were going through the game park. And in this game park, there's paved roads and then there's gravel roads. And we were back on one of those gravel roads where there was bush and jungle on both sides of the road. And we had been driving for about an hour, and we got back in there, and there was an elephant that was blocking the road. He was sitting there eating, and so we couldn't get past this elephant. And so we're like, oh, we'll just sit here and we'll watch this elephant. And he was eating, and we noticed that he was in must, so in mating season, so they can be a little bit cantankerous during that time of year. And so we're like, you know what, we'll stay back a little ways because we don't want to bother this guy. And we turned off the car and like, you know what, if any other elephants are coming, we'll be able to hear them because obviously they're going to sound like a herd of elephants. And so we sat there listening, and we found out that when elephants walk on a road, they do not sound like a herd of elephants. And about a half hour after sitting there, we looked in our rearview mirror, and a whole herd of elephants came around the corner with all these, the moms and babies and juveniles all behind us. And wouldn't you know it, this elephant that was in front of us, that was calmly eating away for a half hour, turned around and wanted to get past us. And we were, at that point, we were sitting on a one-lane bridge. So we were in the way of him getting to the females. And so this elephant did 2 mock charges at us. And the mock charge is when they flap out their ears and make a bunch of noise and charge at you like they're going to hit you, which is terrifying in and of itself. But he charged us 2 times, and we didn't have anywhere to go. If we backed up, we were going to hit the other elephants. Couldn't go forward. He was there. We were on a one-lane bridge. And then he moved off to one side. I'm like, all right, this is it. Now or never. And so I floored our 4x4 and turned off the road. So I pulled
Got off the bridge.
off the bridge. Yes, thankfully off the bridge, and into the bush. And we were driving over like 8 feet tall trees and just plowing them over. And I thought the turbo in the vehicle kicked in. I'm like, all right, we're just about good. And heard my father-in-law say, "Oh, he's coming," and turned. And right then, this elephant crushed into our car, put his tusks through the doors, Didn't go all the way through. It pushed in the door panels, but it lifted our car 3 feet on one side. So if this kind of dates me, but Dukes of Hazard, driving on two wheels. Okay, that was us. We were on two wheels,
And we have witnesses from our church that were in a vehicle behind you guys, so this is truth.
and we have pictorial evidence of holes in our car too. Um, but I just kept it floored, and we kept driving, and the tusks ripped through the door some, and then the car finally pulled away and came back down on all four and swerved back onto the road and got out of there. Uh, Thankfully, by God's grace, we were not injured. And
Unless you call the chest pain that my dad had for the next 24 hours,
yeah, there
but
was that.
we did manage that.
Thankfully, there was nothing, no lasting repercussions. But when you think about sin and Satan, how they want to destroy us, just like that elephant, sin is very dangerous. We may think that we're safe and we can get close, but sin wants to destroy us.
Mm.
And when we allow sin in our minds, it puts us seconds away from attack. In absolute flash, just like us, our world can be turned upside down. And sin and Satan, they want to cut us off from our source of power. They want to drive a wedge between us and God. So that's the first barrier there is disobedience. And the second barrier is pride. Now, couple of illustrations about this. Our youngest daughter, Natalie, she loves to photobomb. Ever since she's been, I don't know how old was she when she first started doing that.
I don't know, walking.
Yeah. Yeah. Anytime she could get in there. So anytime she saw a photo, man, you'd pop up in the back and she'd photobomb it.
She's still doing that to this day.
Still doing that. And it's usually pretty funny for her because she's got a lot of personality. And so it adds to the photo usually. So, but if you've ever been around a photo bomber that just won't quit and you just can't get the photo, thankfully she does quit when you tell her to. That can be like us when remember when he talked about how God wants, desires, and deserves his glory. He wants to be the one in the picture. And when we come along, even in ministry, sometimes this happens, we can kind of try to photobomb God. And it's kind of like us trying to get in the picture and have other people notice us instead of us helping to show God's glory. And that's really the whole point of our life, is to show the greatness of God, not to be trying to photobomb God and get in the picture. So another illustration is it's kind of like embezzling glory from God. And if someone worked at a bank and every day they just took out a little bit of the funds from the bank, and not all of it, just a little bit here and there. But the same thing happens with us when we embezzle glory, when we try to get a little bit of credit for things, or we try to get in the picture. That's really embezzling glory from God. And I think it's really easy for us in ministry, especially in missions, to try to do that, even maybe unintentionally. It could even be in how we're presenting our ministry. And so it's really easy to do that. But it's so important for us to remember that all the glory belongs to God. His primary goal is to glorify himself. And he's looking for servants that don't get in the way of that. And that's so important for us to remember that. And so the last barrier, the third one, is unbelief, because God wants his servants to demonstrate faith. And we want others to trust God for their eternal salvation. But when we don't trust God, when we're as his servants, when we don't walk in faith, it makes God look small. It makes him look weak. But when we trust God, it really makes God look great. And so God entrusts his servants with trials. He allows us to have problems. And these trials, these problems, these obstacles, these are opportunities for us to make God look great. And I always think of the story of Gideon and Gideon's army, and how Gideon had, a decent sized army, but it's still like a fifth the size of the Midianites. And God's like, nope, your army is too big. We're going to need to knock that down in size some. So he knocks it down some, and then he knocks it down again in size. And the reason for that is I don't have it in front of me here, but it says, God says, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has done this. And so God shrinks us down in size. He wants us to trust Him, and He wants us to rely on Him. And as we go through problems, it allows us to show that He is great. And those tests of faith allow Him to be seen. When we were getting ready for ministering in South Africa, our work there was obviously working with HIV positive people there. And as we faced that, it really forced me to face many different fears. And it revealed different areas that I wasn't trusting God. And at this time we were going there, South Africa was the AIDS hotspot of the world. And what made that go even faster was that there was this belief there among the Zulu tribe, that if you had sex with a virgin, it could cure someone from AIDS. So, since no one knew who those were, South Africa had the highest rape rate and child and infant rape rate in the world at that time. And our ministry was obviously working in the townships, which caused a lot of those statistics. And so the struggle was, as a husband, as a father, would I trust God to take my family to those dangerous places? And there was the risk of potentially coming down with AIDS, and there was the risk of violent crime or rape. Um, and so, in our head, or in my head, I knew that God can keep us as safe as He wants to. He kept Daniel safe from the lions, but sometimes God doesn't choose to keep us safe, does He? And as I was praying through and thinking through that, um, it really forced me to rest fully on the sovereignty of God as just that foundational bedrock of living without fear, of living in faith. And I remember our first day we went to the AIDS support group with our two oldest girls. They were, at the time, they were 4 and 5, and we had talked with them about how to be careful, and what things that they couldn't touch, look out for like open sores and things like that. But we watched them then walk up and down the aisles greeting all these patients, and we didn't really anticipate all the hugs or the handshakes that they would get. And as all these HIV positive patients are hugging your kids, you realize that, even though we can take all the precautions we can, it's not foolproof. And we really had to just to trust that this was what God wanted, and that God would keep us as safe as possible, or safe as He wanted to in that time there. And we when we take all the precautions we can, but we have to trust God. And really just thinking and praying through that, there was two key things that really stood out to me, that I realized there was two different paths that fear can take. And this has been really helpful for me over the years. The first path was to fear something is to fear that God's not in control of that something. So it's fearing that God's not in control, that which is His sovereignty. And the second path is that to fear something is to fear that God's will is not best for our life. And that's a fear of God's goodness not being good enough. And the first one, fear that God's not in control, it really comes down to trusting in God's sovereignty. Is His plan going to be what happens? Most of us believe in our heads that God's in control, but what happens when a trial comes? It really tests our theology. If we were sitting on an airplane somewhere and you had a parachute, and you knew that if you jump out of the airplane, that parachute was going to open. Well, that's one thing, but actually jumping out of the airplane is something very, very different. And in life, problems and storms of life, they test our theology, and it forces us to really trust in God. And as applying that when we were in South Africa, it meant trusting that God was sovereign over the actions of people. If He wanted to prevent violence, rape, disease, all of that stuff, He could do it. There's nothing outside of God's control. And so just constantly remember, to fear something is to fear that God is not in control of that something. And God would really challenge me with that when I'd feel fear starting to rise up. He's like, Kyle, is this something that is outside of my control? Well, the answer is no, it's not. And that revealed that a lot of times my greater fear was actually not unbelief in God's sovereignty. It was unbelief in his goodness.
Mm.
And so that was actually that second kind of fear is that fear that God's will is not best for our life. And that's really rooted in trusting in God's goodness. His goodness flows out of his being. And when we fear that God may allow something into our life that's not for our good, we're fearing that God's not loving toward us. And it's so easy to forget that God is acting from an eternal perspective. He knows what will conform us and change us into the person he wants us to be. He knows what's best for our eternal good, not just our present comfort. But anytime, I don't know about you, for you, anytime my comfort is threatened, we begin to fear because we love our comfort. And we're more concerned with our temporal comfort than improving our eternal joy. So God a lot of times will throw us into a trial or a problem to provide an opportunity for us to improve our eternal comfort. But when we're fearful, it makes God look small in that. And so um, help us overcome that is just to remember that to fear something is to fear that God's will is not best for our life, to remember that he is acting for our eternal good. The trials, they have a purpose. They're meant for our eternal good. And so the two truths I've had to work hard to learn is that first is that nothing gets to us that doesn't pass through the hands of God. And the second one is nothing passes through his hands that's not for his glory and our eternal good. And if we can remember those two things as we're facing trials and problems, it really changes our life and it makes God look great, which is really the purpose of those trials in our lives.
Mm. Yeah, it reminds me of a quote that I wish I had right here in front of me. It was from Nancy DeMoss Wagamuth's book. That's like, if if I knew what God knew, I would be okay with everything that he brought into my life.
Hmm.
That complete submission to his sovereignty and his goodness for that.
Yeah.
But I can see, definitely in ministry when we're talking about wanting to overflow Christ to others, yes, I think we get it. If we have unbelief, if we have pride, if we have those barriers, will be a hindrance. But also, if we're constantly living in fear or in just kind of angst against um, what is essentially the goodness that God brings into our lives, we don't have much to overflow with. I mean, as we're trying to show Christ to others, if we're in fear of what he's brought into our life, that's another way we can definitely make God look small, like not a God
Yeah.
that other people would want to serve. Um, so let's jump to another section of the book where you talk about an oasis, sticking back to that desert theme. Um, Talk to us a bit about the oasis and how we can be like an oasis to those around us.
Yeah. So there was another oasis that we got to visit when we were in Tanzania that we drove out to. Um, I mean, it was in the middle of nowhere. There was
It looked like we were on Mars, this fine powdery
like a
dust that
talcum
just
powder almost.
covered our car. We had to use our windshield wipers. Oh man, it was interesting. Driving on roads that weren't really roads, honestly.
There was just dirt and sand and this talcum powder stuff. We were followed this GPS out to where someone said that there was this oasis, and we got out there, and lo and behold, there was, and it was in the middle of nothing, and all of a sudden there was this beautiful oasis with a pool there with this spring that came pouring out of the underneath the
Dense, lush, gorgeous trees. I
yeah.
mean, it was everything you could think of in a desert oasis.
Yeah. And so we got to swim in this desert oasis there in Tanzania and swing from a rope and drop into the water and everything like that. But that oasis, it provided water in the middle of a desert. And as Christians, That's what our life is like when we're filled to overflowing. We're like an oasis in the desert, and we have the life giving water of God to share with others. And all around us, people are dying from spiritual thirst. They're lost, but they don't even realize it. And this world, it's kind of like a desert. The souls of so many people are pursuing satisfaction through one way or another, but they're doing it through sin and what the world offers, and that's never going to deliver what it promises. And so they're desperate. Unbelievers are desperately seeking satisfaction. They're seeking enjoyment in life, and they're going to pursue it where they can find it. So in this desert of a world, sin kind of works like a mirage. Just as a mirage would trick the person seeing it to thinking, hey, there's something of substance there. Sin does the same thing. It tricks people to think that it's going to satisfy. Or the world offers things like wealth, a good job, popularity, your kid's success, or any other host of things. They trick people to thinking that they're going to satisfy. But when the person gets to the mirage, all they get is a mouthful of sand. It's empty. It doesn't satisfy. And there's no life giving water in sin or what the world offers. And so, all around us, lost people are running from one mirage to the next mirage to the next mirage. And a lot of times we see them and they're like, man, and we're like, wow, they look really satisfied, but they aren't. We see them in the middle of their pursuit. So when they think the next thing is actually going to satisfy them, so they appear happy at the time. But sin and the world have tricked them into thinking that next mirage is real. When they get there, though, it's just a mouthful of sand. And oftentimes that's when people are more receptive to the gospel. It's when they realize that they need living water. And God's word is what's going to break into his heart through the power of the Spirit to change those lives. And our part in that, we mentioned earlier, first of all, is people need to see a difference in us. So if we have faith and trust in God and not, when we're not living in fear, um, that really resonates with people. That is something that's different in our lives. And so part of it is showing it through our life, and the second part is sharing it. And we need to be sharing the hope of the gospel, providing this life-giving water. Like Paul said in 1 Corinthians, I planted, Apollos watered, but God causes the growth. So our part is the planting and the watering of these seeds. And people need that to see that difference, and they need to have us share God's word with us. Because to believe, people need to hear. In this world that is a desert, we can be like a spiritual oasis where people find the life-giving water of Jesus Christ as they see that in us.
Hmm. Yeah. Just that opportunity to think that we can provide life-giving words, to people is huge. I mean, what a task set before us. So if you were standing in front of a group of missionaries or future missionaries, what would you say to them?
I think the biggest thing would be to prioritize your soul.
Mm.
If you want your ministry if you want your ministry to be used by God, then make your heart and the heart of those that you serve your top priority. In Proverbs 4:23, it's kind of the theme verse of the book. It says, "Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life."
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this. It's been challenging in our lives trying
Oh
to
yeah.
live out this content and um, really lean into the scriptures that God tells us that our heart, our actions, take captive our thoughts, that it's all important, not just the tasks I do on the mission field, my daily to-do list. So where can people find the book if they want to read it?
Well, on Amazon, there's paperback, Kindle, or audiobook. If you just type in "overflowing" and then Kyle Farran in the search bar, it'll pull up. Or you can find it through our website at kylefarran.com, and that'll be a link in the show notes there. There's also, if you want to use it, there's a free study guide that you can download and print, or if you'd prefer just to buy one that's already printed, they have that on Amazon as well. But It's really made to be able to be used either personally, or if you have a small group that you want to work through something with, or even as like a one-on-one discipleship with someone. It's really meant to be a tool in that way to help grow in our walk with the Lord.
And the free study guide, that can be downloaded off our website? Off the
Yes.
website?
Yep.
We'll link that?
It's on our website there. Yep.
Great.
We'll put a link in the show notes for that as well.
Okay. Well,
So,
this has been fun. Thanks for coming on your own podcast.
yeah, exactly. But thank you. And I really just hope this book is a blessing to a lot of people for many years to come. Well, that's all for this show. And we want to thank you again for spending your valuable time with us today.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider taking just a moment and giving us a great review. Your review will help people find the podcast and allow these resources to encourage more people. If you took something valuable away from this episode, please share it with someone who would enjoy it.
If you'd like to find the show notes, blog posts, and free resources for ministry and leadership, as well as some information on my book, Overflowing, visit KyleFarran.com. That's KyleFarran.com. Hope to see you soon on a future podcast.